Thank you again to all of you. At this time, we're going to have our Q&A session. Or if you have questions and haven't turned them in yet, you can bring them up here. None? Maybe a few? All right, our first question. Are there implications for a second valve replacement when the first one included a replacement of the ascending aorta through hemiarch?
Hi, back here. So the question is, if you can get your valve replaced if you already had a surgery done?
I believe so. That's what I'm understanding.
So yes, I mean, we can do a lot of things thinking we can redo or go back into the chest after a previous surgery. It makes surgery a little more complex because we don't have the same structures. The planes tend to be more stuck, so it's always a little difficult to get it back inside. And that's why all this percutaneous technology through catheters has been so beneficial, because they decrease the chance of complications getting in. For example, if the aortic valve is the one that's diseased, a lot of patients can get a TAVR, but that has to be assessed by patient case.
Perfect, thank you. Our next question is, if I am allergic to surgical hardware, would I be able to have a mechanical valve? Have patients experienced issues with stents if they are allergy or sensitive to metal?
I can't comment on the valve. In general, not too. It's been reported somewhat about. So the majority of stents are either stainless steel or nickel titanium alloy. So nickel allergy is always a big one. But it fortunately doesn't come up too much. Again, it's just where the stents are placed. They're often fairly covered, depending on what fabric. But again, if a patient does have an allergy to metal, you might want to think about maybe avoiding a stent. There might be some other options.
Perfect, thank you. Next
sorry.
one, which is the best?
I can make a different comment about it. With the aortic prosthesis, there's a lot of different types. Obviously, the big two groups are mechanical versus tissue. Most of the tissue valves are made of either cow or pig. They do have a metal piece inside. There's also full porcine roots that does not have any foreign materials, just the tissue of the pig. So there's alternatives that can be used on patients that have allergies to something specific.
Perfect. Our next question, which is the best heart care hospital in the Twin Cities? I didn't write this. I didn't write any of them. Who's going to answer this?
Hi. I would say the hospital where you go, where you feel the providers listen to you and provide the best available care for you.
Great answer.
Yeah. So I'm personally biased. I work at Minneapolis Heart Institute. There's about 100 of us. In my specific practice, 10 of us trained together at Cleveland Clinic, and we've recruited many people from all over the world. So when I see the care that I see here, and I've had the privilege of working at many internationally renowned hospitals, I would say, wherever you get the best care, but I think you should take a look at us too.
I have a unicuspid aortic valve. Any evidence of specific genes for this defect?
Oh, is it? I would say that unicuspid aortic valve-ish is in the VAV spectrum. There are no specific valves for that type of valve defect. I would say often we see it too in kids with congenital heart defects and intellectual disability that can go along with some like intellectual disability, multiple congenital anomaly syndromes, but as an isolated thing, no.
Perfect, thank you. Do changes in digestion impact my INR if I take warfarin?
Yeah, good question. So changes in digestion, I would say just in general when we're looking at INR, so diarrhea is a big one that can contribute and can lead to fluctuations. So I guess, I don't know where the question came from, if there was a specific in terms of like, is this more acute changes in digestion or kind of a chronic picture?
Next question.
Yeah, so
Perfect.
just to kind of wrap that, so yes, I'd say acutely diarrhea certainly can. In terms of chronic changes, we do see like in cases where someone has a gastric bypass procedure, where we do have changes just in how the stomach is processing medications as well as food, that there can sometimes be changes, and especially, it's maybe going off on a tangent, but right after a gastric bypass surgery, we can see big changes in INR and warfarin requirements. So hopefully that kind of answered the question.
Perfect. And hold on to the mic. I have another one for you.
Sure.
Are there any medicines on the horizon to replace warfarin to use with mechanical valves?
Yeah, great question. So as I kind of had mentioned in my talk, so at this point, the kind of alternative anticoagulant, oral medications called the DOACs, at this point, none of them are likely to be studied again just because the one dabigatran that was studied in that population showed worse outcomes. So out of what's out there now, I would say no. I haven't heard of anything on the horizon, but that's not to say, not possible. There are some kind of similar agents to the DOACs that are kind of slightly different pathway that, I haven't heard anything as far as studies looking at that, but I think it's going to be a tough population to study just based off of what's been seen in the risks so far with, other DOACs. Good question.
Thank you. Can aortic regurgitation contribute to significant amounts of PVCs and SVTs?
So any kind of valve disease that leads to changes in the loading conditions of the heart, and with aortic regurgitation, sometimes you have high end diastolic pressures and such, and that can for sure increase the number of PVCs from stretching of the left ventricle. Similarly, with the high end diastolic pressure, those people may have elevated atrial pressures, left atrial pressures, and they're predisposed to getting atrial arrhythmias such as atrial fibrillation and atrial flutter. So, the heart is an interesting organ in the sense that, the pumping function of the heart or the mechanical function of the heart is very linked to the electrical activity of the heart, and sometimes the electrical problem causes some of the structural and functional problems, and sometimes it's the other way around.
Perfect. Thank you. Next question. What should you do or not do if you have a bulge in your aortic graft or stent? How do you prevent this from bursting?
I think it depends a little bit on what the bulge is. Sometimes if the aneurysm is still present if the patient had an endovascular repair and there's still the aneurysm there, it kind of depends a little bit on how sort of pressurized that bulge is. And then there's certain irregularities that can occur next to a repair, like called a pseudoaneurysm. And those are usually more of a concern, and then you'd really want to kind of limit really exertional activities just to, but I think the most important thing is to really figure out what this bulge is, and so that it can, because again, it could be something that's probably not too big of an issue, or it could be a real concern.
Thank you. Many aortic dissection patients think they aren't at risk for a AAA. Is this true or false?
I would say that's false if I had to pick one. First and foremost, we sort of know that anybody who has an aortic aneurysm in one location has somewhere around a 20 to 30% chance of having another one. The most common form of aortic dissection that we see is, on the cardiac side anyway, is what we call the DeBakey type 1s, where the whole aorta is affected, right? So when that happens, your whole aorta is no longer normal. So you're at an increased risk of what we call aneurysmal degeneration of the remainder of your aorta, which sort of dovetails into the comments I made earlier about the importance of regular follow-up. So briefly, yes, I believe that's false. And sort of more detailed, it's that once you have an event, your aorta has declared itself as sort of not behaving properly, right? So the rest of it cannot behave properly down the long term as well.
Thank you. Piggybacking off of it, are they genetic?
Are you referring to AAA?
Yes.
Abdominal aortic
Yep.
aneurysm? There probably is, well, one, the genetic aortopathies, connective tissue disorders can definitely predispose to abdominal aortic aneurysms. I'd be curious, my question I didn't submit to the vascular surgeon was, I don't know if there's any data to suggest with BAV and aneurysm if AAAs are increased. But there likely is a genetic component to abdominal aortic aneurysms. We do see them cluster rarely in families. Again, when we think about genetics versus environment, right, the take-home lesson is if it's early onset in a generally healthy person, more likely to think genetics. If it's later onset, someone who has sleep apnea, cholesterol issues, obesity, issues, it might be more environmental, and those things can also cluster in families. So right now there's no specific gene test for abdominal aortic aneurysm. If it's isolated, if you have a thoracic aortic aneurysm and a AAA, you might want to consider genetic testing. There have been studies where we look at large populations of people with aneurysms and then compared to the general population without. And we say, oh gosh, are there some minor genetic alleles, loci, variants that are increased in this population and decreased in this population? And there might be some associations, but definitely not anything that would predict risk or that you would use to help other family members. So likely genetic, but not ready for prime time at all.
She can keep the mic.
Okay.
How many, I'm going to butcher this again. How many aortopathy genes are there? Did I say it right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or aortic disease. You can always just say aortic
Okay.
disease instead of aortopathy. It's a challenging one. Great question. I would say somewhere in the range probably of about 40 to 50. I think we are finding more genes. That's why genetic testing, especially if you have a familial component, can be very helpful because we are discovering new things if it's unique to your family. The caveat is that a lot of those panels are going to test for like the lowest hanging fruit, the most likely conditions that go with aortic aneurysms. Aortic aneurysms can also present with chromosome disorders or other genetic syndromes where, again, there might be other congenital anomalies or intellectual disability. So that's why a geneticist who's taking a really good, or a genetic counselor, a really good family history, medical history, will help you find a really good genetic testing plan for you and your family specifically.
I'm going to piggyback again. How often should you be retested?
Great question. I'll be honest. So genetic testing technology, we started with like a single gene, and then we went to like a panel of genes. And technology is moving then to a technology called exome or genome sequencing, which means instead of testing for 40 genes, we're going to test all 23,000 genes. Sounds great, like you're going to find everything. You're not. We only know a portion of what those genes do. And so a lot of testing companies are putting their resources behind this whole genome exome, testing all thousands and thousands of your genes, and not investing in updated panels. And so the panels for aortopathy testing haven't really changed since about 2018, 2019, even though we've discovered new genes. So if you've had testing within like the past 5 years, there's not really a lot of new genes added. I think we're gonna just go to that whole exome sequencing, whole genome sequencing in the next 5 years. That is actually good news because once your DNA is sequenced and fully sequenced, your DNA doesn't change. So you will always have that DNA sequence so that we can keep going back to it to look for new changes. I will say something about that too, is that, if you do have a family history and you haven't done any genetic testing, you should do that. But a lot of people get genetic testing for their family members, right? Like, I'm not worried about you, I'm worried about my kids and my grandkids, and I want to know what's going on for them. In that circumstance, depending upon your insurance and circumstances, getting a whole exome, getting a whole genome, and having that DNA data that is like a legacy gift to the next generations to learn from your medical health is something, that you could talk to your genetics doctor about too.
Thank you. Before our special video, I would like to thank Dr. Kevin Harris for inviting his Minneapolis Heart Institute colleagues to Rock from the Heart today. Can we all give them a round of applause?